Western Russia, 2016. A lone soldier slowly makes their way into a darkened corridor. While exploring a tunnel system deep underground, they've stumbled across a small, derelict bunker, and with only the light mounted to their pistol to guide them, they press slowly into the open space beyond. The place is a mess. Shards of concrete, rubble, and an excess of mud litter the ground. There's mold on the walls, and clearly the area has been uninhabited for years, maybe even decades. The man takes a thorough sweep, examines every corner, every nook and cranny, until eventually, after some time, he's satisfied, because in spite of the derelict conditions, he's finally found a place to call home. Over the coming days and weeks, he brings what little equipment he has to the bunker and installs some crude amenities. They're easily some of the best living conditions the soldiers had in over a year. But in spite of the comfort this humble suite offers him, he knows that before long, he'll have to venture out for food, water, and most importantly of all, ammunition. When the day finally comes, he latches the door to his newfound hideout behind him, makes for the surface, and when finally poking his head out into the world above, the eerily familiar stillness of the city overwhelms him. He makes his way past the abandoned shops, many with windows shattered and doors blown off their hinges, and somewhere in the distance, the sounds of automatic gunfire issue forth. Just another day, in one of the most hostile locations in the modern world. Just a few years prior, this area would have been among the most promising and revered in the entirety of Eastern Europe. Those who lived here would have had all the reason to believe their future would be a prosperous one. So how did it all go to hell in less than a decade? Welcome to the world of Escape from Tarkov, a game which has often been called the most difficult, most realistic, and most hardcore shooter ever put to screen. It's a title that's attracted the attention of millions around the world for its gritty action, uniquely suspenseful atmosphere, and commitment to realistic gunplay. But the truth is that in spite of this reputation, Escape from Tarkov is much more than a compelling military simulator. The in-universe story behind this game is one of my favorites, and yet it's something that you don't see talked about very much, especially among Western audiences. And many folks, even those who have put substantial time in the game, may not entirely know what's going on here. However, the story of Tarkov is about to become very important, since at the time of recording, the game's beta phase, which it's been in for almost 9 years, is expected to come to an end sometime in late 2025. With version 1.0, it seems we'll finally see a proper conclusion to the story, and so for both new and veteran players alike, I think it's time we get caught up with the full story so far. This is the full lore of Escape from Tarkov. Let's take a step back. The story of Tarkov effectively begins in 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union. As the Cold War ends and post-Soviet states begin governing themselves autonomously, the world seems hopeful. But for the newly established Russian Federation, the governmental body that would assume control of Russia, the largest post-Soviet nation, there's substantial work to be done. The past several decades of Soviet control had severely undermined Russia's relationships with several of the world's most powerful nations, especially in the West, and repairing those bonds wasn't going to be an easy task. But as hardline communism began to fall out of favor, the government was ready to make amends and begin moving the new nation forward. To do this, the country knew they needed to not only embrace the aid of world powers, but also to prove itself capable of forward progress. What the state ultimately sought was a symbol, something to bridge the divide between themselves and the Western world. And so, it was to this end that in the timeline of Escape from Tarkov, the Norvinsk Special Economic Zone would first be established. Positioned on the country's western seaport, the Norvinsk Zone, otherwise known as the Norvinsk region, was poised as an opulent sector of Russia, established specifically to attract foreign tourists, and more importantly, foreign business. It was meant as a sort of beacon, signifying both to themselves and the rest of the world Russia's commitment to growth and economic progress. And even prior to many of the area's urban developments, Norvinsk certainly had the makings of a popular destination. The area would feature plenty of lush greenery at sites such as the sprawling Priozersk Nature Reserve, miles of serene shoreline, and many other natural attractions for both locals and foreigners. Russia's newfound commitment to capitalist ideology would also have been evident in areas such as the Ultra Shopping Mall, located in the eastern portion of the region. But without a doubt, the most impressive site in all of Norvinsk, which lay at her epicenter, was the city of Tarkov. At the time, Tarkov would have easily been one of the most modern, architecturally advanced cities, not just in all of Russia, but in the entirety of Eastern Europe. It would feature high-class residential complexes, eateries, entertainment venues, and a variety of local shops, but the beating heart of the city was, of course, its business sector. You see, in spite of Norvinsk's many splendors, the area wouldn't become a hub for foreign industry merely for the sake of it. Rather, the Russian government knew that in order for the region to be successful, they were going to have to offer something to the Western industries they were hoping to court, something that they wouldn't be able to get anywhere else in the world. And in this interest, the Special Economic Zone quickly became one of the least restrictive places to do business in the entire developed world, a move that ensured foreign partners would be lining up to open shop. Within a short amount of time, Tarkov City, and in fact the entirety of Norvinsk, would benefit tremendously from the resulting influx of business, and soon a major port would be established along the coast, which would only expedite the growth even further. But as many of you may have already guessed, the region's lax approach to business-related policy was attractive to more than just legitimate enterprises. At first, it would have only been a small subset of businesses that would show a particularly strong interest in the lack of governmental oversight, but over time that number would grow, until eventually, sometime in the early 2000s, one particular company, known as TerraGroup, would set their sights on the city. And as the people of Tarkov would quickly come to understand, TerraGroup was easily the most corrupt and dangerous corporate entity of them all. As their name suggests, TerraGroup is not a traditional business, but rather a conglomerate, a type of corporate structure that oversees several other business entities operating in different industries and fields, usually with some level of autonomy. In other words, they can be thought of as a collection of corporations, a business hive mind of sorts, all working toward the same goals. Goals which, in the case of TerraGroup, aren't fully understood even today. Even within the earliest mentions of the organization in Tarkov lore, TerraGroup had already established themselves as a brand with global influence, conducting business in over 120 different countries. But they were also no strangers to controversy. Even the earliest headline we can find concerning TerraGroup already implicates them in shady offshore dealings. In 2008, the company would enter the Congo, where they would quickly purchase a substantial position in local mining operations for zinc, copper, diamond, and later uranium. In and of itself, a story like this probably wouldn't have made headlines, except for the fact that shortly hereafter, the Congo government would enter a lawsuit against TerraGroup directly on accusations of illegal mining methods and the unlawful use of a private military force during confrontations with civilians. Indeed, one of the things that TerraGroup would quickly become known for wherever they set up shop was their excessive use of private security at sites which they managed. But these weren't just any armed personnel. Over the years, the company had formed a close relationship with the United Security Company, or USEC, which is a name that all Tarkov players ought to recognize. But to understand the true impact that the USEC organization plays in this story, we have to first get a feel for its history. USEC was originally born out of a merger between the security companies Kernisec, established by American businessman Brian Kernighan, and SafeSea, founded by retired Royal Marines Colonel John Berger. Both companies stemmed from humble beginnings, Kernighan having first entered the private defense trade when looking for a way to secure his international trucking business, which regularly made trips through the Mexican-American border. And as for Berger, he'd founded SafeSea in 1994 after working as a private military contractor, or PMC, for a number of small maritime security agencies. After Kernighan's agency would merge with fellow American security company Redbird, the business would expand at an exceptional pace, leading to the eventual merger with SafeSea that would lead to USEC's establishment in 1999. And in less than a decade, the agency would attain a reputation for incomparable discrepancy and professionalism. By 2007, they had quickly attained contracts not just with civilians, but entire governments, having assisted America in the Iraq War, and all while maintaining inscrutable discretion. Perhaps it was this quality that TerraGroup had first recognized back in 2004, when they hired the company to overtake physical security at all of their sites worldwide, though unlike many of the conglomerate's other business partners, USEC wouldn't be directly absorbed by them and was able to continue operating as an independent entity. Composed almost entirely of retired American and European servicemen, USEC would from here rapidly become an expected, if intimidating presence wherever TerraGroup could be found, including, of course, in Norvinsk. The exact date of TerraGroup's arrival in Tarkov is subject to conflicting information. The official Escape from Tarkov Raid live-action series states that the organization arrived in the region as late as 2015, but even though this information is the most current as of recording, it also goes against a lot of the history that's been built up since the beginning of the series. Rather, it seems that TerraGroup could have been operating in Russia considerably earlier, with the first direct mention of associated activity occurring in early 2009, when TerraGroup Labs, one of the company's UK-based subsidiaries, would first set up a branch of their operations within Tarkov City. Officially, TerraGroup Labs is a bio and agricultural research organization, but almost immediately after their arrival, a set of strange dealings would take place. Over the course of the coming months, TerraGroup representatives would conduct illicit negotiations with the Tarkov municipal government, illegally gaining control over several properties and tracts of land that had been allocated for the purpose of housing development or industry in trade for a $30 million stimulus to the local economy. One of the sites that TerraGroup Labs would gain control over here was the famous Chemical Plant 16, which Escape from Tarkov players may know for its in-game name, Factory, and which would also immediately begin producing a number of strange substances under the orders of the company. At this site and many others, TerraGroup Labs' facilities were covertly installed. Conveniently, the municipal government would also turn the other cheek when it came to this, as well as the extensive use of USEC security forces, which was not generally permissible in the area under law, especially since, as TerraGroup's influence grew, military hardware and personnel would be ferried into the port literally by the boatload, likely through cargo freighters belonging to Paradigm Shipping, a Japanese shipping company that the conglomerate would acquire outright just 2 years later. TerraGroup's connections to Tarkov weren't just restricted to local government, though. Throughout the coming years, the organization would foster connections with private enterprises throughout the Special Economic Zone, sometimes establishing contact directly, but other times operating through one or more of their vast arsenal of subsidiaries and shell companies, in order to obfuscate ties. And perhaps one of the strangest associates that would come into the fold this way was the Azure Coast Health Resort, situated on Tarkov's shoreline. The resort appears to have first come into contact through the Gnosis Company, a recently identified TerraGroup contractor which officially specialized in the construction of amusement parks, playgrounds, and other family entertainment venues, but is revealed during a special new questline in Escape from Tarkov added with the Labyrinth event. This organization would facilitate a series of operations beneath the health resort itself, which decidedly had nothing to do with their stated purpose. While it's not entirely certain how long Azure Coast has existed in the timeline of the Tarkov series, we're told that an extensive Soviet-era bomb shelter is present underneath, which, by way of Gnosis, would end up being converted into a sort of lab space, all while the resort above would go on to become one of TerraGroup's most valuable and unlikely domestic partners. However, as the corporation began to spread its influence further and further, it would only be a matter of time until they drew the suspicion of the Russian government, which, unbeknownst to anyone at the time, would mark the beginning of the end for the city of Tarkov as we know it. August 5th, 2011. In a secret operation spanning years, the Russian Federation had been conducting a lengthy investigation into the illegal activities of TerraGroup, and in the process, they had uncovered the conspiratorial dealings between the company and the municipal government that had taken place back in 2009. A case is opened against the former Tarkov mayor, citing his illegal seizure of municipal land that was then authorized for use to TerraGroup Labs. And shortly thereafter, a court order is issued to seize all Russian-owned assets from TerraGroup Labs locations based in the city, effective the following day. So, on August 6th at 10 a.m. local time, Federal Security Service or FSB investigators arrived at TerraGroup's Tarkov headquarters. Their purpose, as stated before, was to peaceably recollect Russian municipal and governmental assets from the city. Nothing more and nothing less. As expected though, they were met by USEC security and denied entry even when search and seizure warrants were presented. Unfortunately, this wasn't wholly unexpected. Both the FSB and the prosecution officials accompanying them were, at this point, well aware of TerraGroup's propensity for armed guards, but their willingness to deny a lawful order left the response team with little choice but to escalate the situation further. After all, to comply with USEC's demands would set a dangerous precedent, a precedent that any sufficiently armed corporate entity would be above the law in Norvinsk. And so, their hand forced, FSB would call for backup, and after a short amount of time, they'd be joined by members of the Mobile Special Police Unit, or OMON, alongside 2 new FSB rapid response teams. Quickly, the go-ahead was given, and both rapid response units would enter the building at different angles. And unfortunately, though perhaps not altogether unexpectedly, they would immediately find themselves under fire by USEC. What the FSB and Investigation Committee never could have expected, though, was the sheer ferocity of USEC's response. As it turns out, the military equipment that TerraGroup had been smuggling into Tarkov didn't just consist of conventional weapons, gear, and personnel, because not long into the engagement, USEC would begin deploying hand grenades and machine guns against the enforcing officers. What would follow was a 45-minute standoff between USEC forces and the drastically underarmed FSB and prosecution investigators, of which 18 investigators and 21 FSB agents would be killed. Most of these casualties would come in the final minutes of the fighting, when 2 vehicles filled with prosecution employees were destroyed by fire from a grenade launcher positioned in the upper stories of the building. In the eyes of many, these are the first shots that would forever change the landscape of Tarkov. But unfortunately, the tribulations of the day didn't end here, because just 3 hours later, at 1:42 p.m., the now abandoned headquarters of TerraGroup Labs was subjected to remote detonation, rendering much of the building inaccessible and presumably destroying mountains of evidence concerning the nature of TerraGroup and TerraGroup Labs' activities. The siege at TerraGroup headquarters is easily one of the most influential and harrowing events in the entire timeline of the Tarkov series, and the aftermath of that fateful encounter can still be viewed firsthand by visiting the in-game map appropriately named Ground Zero. Here, players will find the desecrated remains of the TerraGroup building in question, but what the map doesn't so much capture is the events that would occur directly after this point, and indeed, mere minutes after the explosion, the first wave of evacuations would begin. For many years, little was known about the specifics of when, where, and how Tarkov's citizens were removed from the city. Mentions of the evacuations themselves were only ever made in passing, but more recently, in the official Escape from Tarkov companion books written by Alexander Kondorovich, the specifics surrounding what exactly transpired here were greatly expanded upon. Within this trilogy, we follow the story of an international TerraGroup Labs employee by the name of Dennis, who lived and worked within the Norvinsk region before the fateful day of the attack at TerraGroup headquarters, and subsequently follows his struggle for survival as the city of Tarkov falls into lawlessness and chaos. In the course of the first book, entitled Predator, there's a point where Dennis is taken captive by an organized group of hooded figures, and while in captivity, he meets a man named Ivan, a former police officer who remembers well the day of the disaster, and offers Dennis some interesting insights. From his further explanations, it transpired that my cellmate, whose face I still couldn't see, had been a policeman in the Traffic Safety Division. On the day when everything kicked off in the city, he had been working at a patrol post on the outskirts. According to him, what happened had not been an accident. We were already well prepared for something of the sort. There'd been 2 special training courses. There were new buses at the bus park. A lot of them, in fact, more than the city will ever need. Everybody knew we were getting ready for something, but nobody knew what. A friend of mine was a local beat cop, said they'd been sent around to all the residential buildings to throw together a plan for who should be evacuated, and in what order. As Ivan explained it, all the work to evacuate the population could have been completed on time. That's what everyone expected and was preparing for. He'd seen the plan of deployment for his own department with his own eyes. It certainly didn't look like the plan had been thrown together at the last minute. It was a properly drafted and printed official document. However, somebody somewhere had screwed everything up. First, there was a big explosion somewhere in the center of town. Then, evacuation buses had been attacked in several places simultaneously. The unknown attackers had opened fire on the patrol cars escorting the buses, too. There had been casualties, although nobody had managed to work out exactly how many. Although the book never explicitly tells us, we can pretty easily deduce that the explosion heard near the city center may well have been the detonation of the TerraGroup Labs building following the skirmish between FSB and USEC. But something doesn't add up here. Prior to the TerraGroup building incident, tensions in Tarkov had been high, but by no means explosive. Civilians were perhaps on edge given the prevalence of USEC security around various sites, but up to this point, we've been led to believe that violence wasn't particularly expected by anyone. Yet, seemingly on the very day of the disaster which would change the trajectory of life in the city, local law enforcement had already been extensively briefed on evacuation plans. Plans that definitely sound to have been thoroughly reviewed and premeditated. The implication, then, is obvious. Somebody knew that a violent encounter would take place, whether they be a member of the local government with links to TerraGroup itself, or someone even higher in the chain of command. However, in the same breath, we're also told that the execution of evacuation plans was in no small way disrupted by a mysterious third party, apparently firing on civilians and law enforcement alike. We don't know and are never directly told who this group is, and there are many potential candidates, including members of TerraGroup themselves, but I'll leave that for you to discuss in the comments. Together, the oddities surrounding this whole scenario definitely paint the picture that there's some unknown information here that we're yet to uncover. But surprisingly, neither the convenient coincidence surrounding the evacuations themselves nor this third party are even the most perplexing part of Ivan's recollection. Then there was some kind of flash, a blue flame across the sky, and all communications went to hell. Our mobile phones stopped working, some of our radios burnt out, and from the ones that survived, all we could hear was the groups closest to us. We did manage to find out that the troops approaching the city were met with mines and machine gun fire. Then we all freaked out too. The guys started to split up, some of them running off to their families, and the rest of us headed for the transport police headquarters. We were shot at on the way. Why and by whom? I do not know. For a long time, the blue flame was far and away one of the most mysterious elements in Escape from Tarkov lore. Based on the context surrounding it, it isn't hard to conclude what this enigmatic light in the sky actually was, but this is really only the beginning. The way the blue flame is said to have affected electronics is consistent with what we would expect of an electromagnetic pulse or EMP of some kind, emanating from an unknown device deeper within the city. But even with this information in mind, the question that has long plagued the minds of fans is what exactly caused the EMP in the first place, which is something that's never been 100% confirmed. However, more recently, there's been some information that could potentially allude to the origin of this device, and in fact, it's something that we've already touched on. The Quest Hypotheses testing is one which was added to Escape from Tarkov alongside the Labyrinth event in 2025, and in it, we're tasked with delivering 5 laborious research notes to the traitor mechanic. To do this, we have to venture into the Labyrinth, the modern-day version of those secret labs set up by Knossos beneath the health resort. The only way to get to the Labyrinth is by taking a secret transit from the map Shoreline, and once inside, we can find this room, which is where the research notes can sometimes spawn. And once the research notes have been found, Mechanic will offer us a bit of insight into the history of this area, stating, quote, "The data is fragmented, but still extremely useful. The health resort's basements have changed a lot since the disaster began, but at some point in time, they were definitely used as a testing ground for some kind of weapon, an experimental EW, or hacking device maybe. This remains to be determined. I can already see that some of the measurements and experiments will be very useful in their own right, so your labors were definitely not in vain. Thank you." EW, short for Electronic Warfare, is a type of combat that involves using electromagnetism, radio, and other electrical emissions in order to either attack or disrupt enemy operations. Its scope is wide, but modules like EMPs definitely fall within its purview. So could the device that created the so-called blue flame have originated from this secret facility located in the Labyrinth? Although it's only a theory, it's by far the best explanation we have as of recording. There's even a chance that this device may have been nuclear in nature, which is not only evidenced by TerraGroup's interest in mining uranium years prior, but also because nuclear blasts are known to possess the ability to disrupt electronics, and the associated blue light can be explained as an outburst of ionizing radiation. Once again though, that's only a theory. Just as strange as the EMP itself, though, is the effect that it would have on some of Tarkov's local population. To a small subset of those who witnessed the blue flame firsthand, the event would come across as almost rapturous, and in time, a bona fide religious cult would form around its worship. These cultists are an ever-present force in Tarkov, even within the modern day. They move by night, adorn themselves in black cloaks, utilize strange, poison-tipped blades, and many seem to have a strange connection with TerraGroup themselves. In fact, the cultists seem to be the very same hooded figures that first took Dennis hostage within the Predator novel excerpt that we just mentioned. At the same time that Ivan was witnessing this botched evacuation effort though, only a few miles away, at Bay 5 of the Tarkov cargo port, TerraGroup employees were being subtly exfiltrated in their own way. Less than an hour after the detonation at the TerraGroup headquarters building, at 2:31 p.m., a freighter ship owned by a Tanzanian subsidiary of TerraGroup was seen hastily departing from port. Obviously, this would draw suspicion, so a little over 2 hours later, at 4:43 p.m., a federal border guard boat dispatched from Norvinsk naval base intercepted the freighters a short distance from the Russian Federation's naval border. When the freighter did not stop, the border guard would fire on the vessel, but they could not bring it down or slow its progress before it entered international waters. In the meantime though, on August 8th, a new set of court orders would be issued to seize not just Russian property that had been wrongfully used, but all TerraGroup Labs' assets along with them. With the full force of the law behind this decision, 211 of the 652 registered TerraGroup staff within the region were quickly detained and released the same day with restricted travel privileges. The locations of all others were not determined, but only a few days later, new information about the freighter would seem to confirm the whereabouts of at least some. By this point, the lost ship, known officially as the Ocean Slogger, was spotted in the Danish port Køge. It's said that around 50 to 80 people beside crew disembarked and were hurriedly transported away by a series of minibuses with tinted windows. Unconfirmed reports would later suggest that all of these elusive figures, likely TerraGroup staff, would later leave the country on the same day. Then, on August 12th, the Ocean Slogger would depart and make for Iceland, but only a few days into the journey, on 11:17 p.m. of the 15th, the Icelandic Coast Guard would receive a distress call. Exactly 4 minutes later, the call would cease, and the Slogger was officially deemed lost, never to be seen again. The Russian government was furious. TerraGroup was slipping through their fingers, and aside from a first-hand account of the events of the 6th offered by a surviving member of Oman, not many new leads were materializing. That was, at least, until they would learn of the secret affiliations TerraGroup had cultivated throughout both the private and public sector. They would rightfully suspect that staff could still be hiding within such locations in secret. Legal allegations would proceed throughout the rest of the month, starting just 2 days later on August 15th, where TerraGroup and TerraGroup Labs began an international lawsuit against the Russian Federation directly, and much to the chagrin of the Federation, they'd even appeal to the United Nations. The UN would respond with an emergency session. They would demand Russia to remove armed forces from previously affected public areas, as well as provide foreign TerraGroup Labs staff with the freedom to travel. Also, from this day forward, a small UN peacekeeping force would be deployed to Norvinsk in hopes of de-escalating violence and to protect citizens, which, in short order, would prove to be quite the problematic turn of events for Russia itself. Although the Russian military would withdraw in the presence of UN forces, it would take less than a week for interior troops to begin exchanging fire with UN forces in the vicinity of the port cargo terminal. Fortunately, the crossfire would quickly cease, and afterwards, witnesses would state that the encounter was apparently provoked by a mysterious, unidentified third party, likely the same party that had disrupted the initial evacuation efforts weeks prior. Even so, in order to avoid further escalation, and at the demand of the UN Security Council, Russian forces were completely withdrawn from Norvinsk altogether, and UN forces would officially take control. Unofficially though, the government knew that they needed to act fast if they had any intent of bringing TerraGroup and USEC to justice. And it was to this end that a top-secret militarized organization known as the Battle Encounter Assault Regiment, or BEAR, would be created on October 24th of 2011. Composed of current and former Spetsnaz soldiers, BEAR was deliberately created to be equal and opposite to USEC. Following the TerraGroup headquarters disaster, the objectives of USEC had largely pivoted from guarding TerraGroup sites to retrieving and destroying sensitive property in order to maintain secrecy, but BEAR was deployed to do precisely the opposite. They would be sent to undermine USEC, to thin their numbers, and to uncover or intercept any and all evidence of wrongdoing in hopes of finally cracking the secrets of TerraGroup wide open. Although their duties would come straight from the top though, BEAR was subsequently contracted to a non-governmental agency in order to obfuscate ties with the Kremlin. And when BEAR made their first public appearance, they'd come out swinging. Welcome to the age of the contract wars. The Contract Wars, as their name would suggest, were a set of conflicts fought between BEAR and USEC on a global scale. Although the war has passed by the time of Escape from Tarkov, the scenario would serve as both the setting and namesake of the first ever title created by Tarkov's developer, Battlestate Games, which was released on December 18th of 2012. The game is said to take place 2 years after the start of the all-out faction conflict in Norvinsk, and although light on story elements, many of the maps within the Contract Wars game, as well as its spiritual remake, 2021's Hired Ops, may be familiar to Tarkov players. While the grittiness of the wars themselves is somewhat lost due to the more arcade-like style both of these games employ, the titles certainly demonstrate the ferocity and scale of the conflict, and they present the idea that the battle for TerraGroup secrets was a multinational one. Unfortunately for Russia though, all of this fighting would only continue to attract unwanted attention. For every USEC soldier who fell, there would be another to take their place. And to make matters worse, the so-called neutral powers, namely the UN, was starting to stick its nose into TerraGroup as well, potentially contesting BEAR and supplying yet another unwanted adversary in the race to uncover lost intelligence. So, in order to quell both of these problems simultaneously, a decision was made. BEAR would seemingly be withdrawn from all sites outside of Norvinsk itself, and then the region was to be completely sealed off. A proposition which the UN actually seems to have supported, likely because it reduced the possibility of Russian and UN forces clashing within the city, thus leading to a potential re-escalation of violence. In accordance with this new policy, the blockade surrounding the region on all sides was further heightened. A complete no-fly order was put into effect on the region's airspace, and all means of official entry to this once thriving area were completely prohibited. Although the evacuations had long since ended, well before the placement of the barricade, it was known even at the time that not all civilians had willingly vacated. In fact, the suburbs and streets of Tarkov would still boast a multitude of stranded citizens who stayed in the region either out of choice or sheer misfortune. Many of these civilians would form small factions of their own in order to survive, and some among them would even attain a legendary status among BEAR and USEC troops for their fearsomeness and brutality. Some of these notable Scavs, or Scav bosses as they would come to be called, were already accustomed to violent acts and criminal activity pre-disaster, such as would be the case with the notorious Kebon, known to haunt the Lexus car dealership along with his gang, or Rashala, a fixer who, accompanied by his bodyguards, has since taken up residence on the map known as Customs. Others, such as Glukar, Kolante, Partisan, and perhaps Sturman, made a name for themselves thanks to their military or law enforcement background and the specific skill set that came along with it. But in some familiar areas of the city, others were rising to power in different ways. As it turns out, the Russian government was very much right about TerraGroup Labs' employees hiding out in many of the areas formerly associated with the company, and in fact, soon enough, stories would begin to circulate about a brutal man named Sanitar, himself rumored to be a former TerraGroup Labs scientist, who, even now, lives out his days in and around the Azur Coast Health Resort, performing wild experiments and guarding the location from wayward PMCs. Another legend that would arise around this time, though, was that of the two twin brothers who had once worked at Chemical Plant 16 after it was acquired by TerraGroup back in 2009. For many years following the acquisition, the factory had worked to produce a number of chemicals for unknown use, foremost among them being a substance known only as blue ice, which can be found in abundance around the Tarkov region, but whose chemical makeup and exact purpose, even as of today, remains unknown. But some have speculated that it was perhaps exposure to this very substance which molded the brothers Tagila and Killa into what they are today. Tagila is the younger of the two, and even now, he's said to stalk his way around the factory, breathing heavily and bearing a small arsenal of automatic rifles and shotguns, as well as his signature sledgehammer. Tagila has never been known to speak, only to yell wildly from behind his customized welding mask whenever he happens upon an intruder. He's fast, strong, and seems almost immune to pain, all qualities which he also shares with his older brother. Violent and iconic as Tagila may be, he pales in comparison to his sibling. Warden of Interchange's ultra shopping mall in the modern day, Killa embodies the same principles as his kin, but in a much more refined and far more deadly manner. It's been said that prior to the contract wars, Killa once attained status as an athlete of some renown, heritage which is still hinted at in his proclivity for Adidas tracksuits and the matching thrice-striped design on his helmet. Much like his brother, Killa is known to rush and gun down those who enter his domain, but unlike Tagila, Killa is smarter, more tactically inclined, and most importantly of all, better armored. Though they've rarely been seen in the same place, except for within rumored encounters in the labyrinth beneath the health resort, this duo was easily one of the most iconic and feared in all of Tarkov, and would remain so right up until the modern day. As time passed though, Tarkov City would slowly grow more and more quiet. Although it's never stated anywhere in the lore, we can reasonably assume that the shutdown at the border was likely the event which brought an end to the contract wars, being as they were primarily fought over territory in and around Tarkov, using copious amounts of guns, ammo, equipment, and personnel that now had no way, at least officially, of reaching the inside of the zone. Of course, restrictions wouldn't completely stem the tide of new supplies and combatants being introduced into the region. Supply planes and helicopters were still observed with some regularity even in spite of the flight ban, but for the first time since the start of the contract wars, demand for weapons, equipment, and even food and water would eclipse supply. So, in increasing fervor and desperation, those left inside would only grow more desperate, relentless, and in some cases, straight up mad. By 2015, we reached the events of the Escape from Tarkov Raid live-action miniseries that we've mentioned previously within this video. Following a group of bear operators as they battle their way through Norvinsk, the series is a must-watch for any Tarkov fans out there, but it also has relevance within the greater narrative of the series as a whole, since some of the information uncovered therein would have ripple effects that, as it turns out, may directly contribute to the events of the game itself. When a search team composed of bear operatives are secretly deployed to Tarkov in order to search for another team headed by a man named Skiff, they happen to uncover recordings of USEC helmet cam footage stowed within the backpack of a Scav, and upon review, USEC operatives can be seen gunning down scientists and researchers at an undisclosed TerraGroup lab's location, likely in a persistent effort to hide evidence of their wrongdoing. It's among some of the first substantial evidence of TerraGroup's atrocities uncovered since the contract wars, but more pressing still is the PMC's realization that the UN forces stationed around Norvinsk don't just prohibit entry to the region, but exit as well. At this point, the writing was on the wall. Neither the UN nor the Russian Federation had any interest in entertaining the atrocities in Norvinsk for any longer. Those inside were forgotten, left to rot alongside the city itself, the living regret of an age gone by. And with increasingly dwindling supply, the legions of USEC and Bear, once tens of thousands of men strong, would dwindle too. By the time that Escape from Tarkov takes place, it's estimated that only between 500 and 1,000 PMC operatives are left in the region, and given the years of thankless violence and critically low supply of food and water, it's here that for the first time in either organization's history, both sides would begin to see a pattern of desertion. While most of these turncoats would slip away individually, there are some examples of large groups forming during this time, such as the Rogues, a faction of former USEC who operate a militarized perimeter north of the Lighthouse, and who are headed by perhaps the most feared bosses in the entire region, the Goon Squad. Consisting of the members Knight, Big Pipe, and Bird Eye, the Goons are a deadly raiding party that always attacks in threes. They're known to stray far from their clan's base of operations, and have the capacity to engage targets on sight at virtually any distance, given each member's proclivity for different types of weapons. As his name would suggest, Bird Eye is the group's sniper, sitting in the backline and taking pot shots, while Knight and Big Pipe approach with automatic rifles and explosive implements respectively. They're a true force to be reckoned with, and in many ways, a success story within the ex-PMC world, dangerous as they may be. But many of those who fled their respective causes would not be so fortunate, nor would they have the means to create groups of their own. What these other ex-operatives would have, though, that the Rogues don't, is a desire, a common goal, to escape from Tarkov or die trying. And this pretty much brings us to the events of the game today. Within Escape from Tarkov, you embody the role of one of these deserting PMCs, and according to the calendar in your hideout, the year is now 2016, and the road toward leaving this place is not going to be an easy one. Luckily, you have a plan, or at least some semblance of one. Your time with USEC or Bear respectively has put you in contact with a number of traitors, fortunate individuals who retain some connection to the world outside, and who, in exchange for money and loyal service, may just be able to arrange your exfil. As you work with each of these contacts, you'll eventually make connections with other influential people in the area as well, such as the BTR driver who operates on woods and streets of Tarkov, Ref, the ringleader of a notorious underground pit fighting ring which actually makes up the setting of Escape from Tarkov Arena, and last but not least, the Lightkeeper, a mysterious information broker who resides in the famous Tarkov lighthouse, guarded by mines, claymore traps, and his dreaded personal guard dog and expert sniper, Ziriachi. As I said at the beginning of this video though, the story of Escape from Tarkov is as of yet unfinished. Even if you're someone who's completed every mission, felled every boss, maxed out your hideaway, and earned favorable reputation with every traitor, the game's ending hasn't yet been revealed. But that's precisely why I bring this story to you now, because when the game goes to 1.0 release later this year, you'll hopefully be prepared to experience Tarkov's story to the fullest. It's unclear what the future holds for our PMCs. Doubtlessly, there are countless tribulations ahead, but I for one couldn't be more excited to see where the story goes next, and whether friend or foe, I hope to see you too on the field of battle. Good luck out there, my friend. This is Everberon. I'll see you again soon, and have a good one.